and we are ready to listen your suggestion on 21C. Thank you very much again.
Okay. Buongiorno. Let me try some Italian. I'm not very good at it. Mi dispiace per il mio italiano e mi dispiace anche per il mio inglese. So I think I said my Italian is terrible and my English is terrible. So I'm from Australia, so both of them are pretty average. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you can see me. I'm trying a new camera setup, so please yell out on the chat line if anything goes wrong. I'm just trying something new here today to see how we go. If someone can stop sharing their screen, that would be great. We won't need a screen share. So thank you very much. Fantastic. So welcome, my name's Connor McDonald, and today we'll be talking about 21C. We have a lot to get through. If you see me turning my head this way, I've got the chat window over here and the camera in front of me. So I'll try, if you have anything to say in the chat line, I'll try see that as well so we don't miss anything. And it's also to keep the sound okay. It's 40 degrees Celsius here in Perth, but I've turned all the air conditioning off to stop interfering with the sound. So you'll just see me get very, very hot and sweaty throughout the rest of the talk, but hopefully you're not repulsed too much by that. So let's have a go. So 21C, why or why not is what we're going to be talking about today. And in doing so, we're going to talk about features mainly, but the first part of this presentation is really just making sure we have an understanding of whether you should be moving to 21C. So here's how you get in touch with me. Probably the easiest way is to reach out to me on Twitter. I love talking technology. My direct messages are always open. You can always reach me on Twitter. I have a blog. I have a YouTube channel. Lots of ways of getting in touch with me. Also, if you're less interested in webinars and video and you're more interested in just listening to technology, I have a podcast as well as now. The latest episode was talking with Nigel Bayless. The Optimizer product manager. So I did 4 episodes talking to Nigel about all things about the Optimizer. So feel free to listen in there. Now, before we begin, I've been saying this for the last 2 years. This is mainly because I live in Perth. This is a selfish reason. Please, let's make sure we get ourselves vaccinated, because the sooner we can get back face to face. Normally this time of year, I would be sitting in a room somewhere in Rome or Milan, having a great time with you, my community colleagues, but not because of the pandemic. So please get yourself vaccinated. If you haven't already, let's get our communities back face to face so we can all enjoy the true community feel. I really miss Italy. So I have 2 important messages for you today in this session. The first one is you must use 21C. You really should be using 21C. And the second message is you must not be using 21C. Now that sounds like I'm a little bit of a hypocrite, but hopefully I'll be able to explain that to you for the rest of this session. So I'm not a hypocrite. There's actually 2 justified reasons why I think everyone should be using 21C and everyone should not be using 21C. So let's start with the easy one first. Why should you not be using 21C? The moment a new release comes out, this is what happens. My messages, whether it's WhatsApp or Slack, Twitter, etc., everyone's just going, I want to learn about 21C. But you need to be aware of a critical thing. Oracle have these things called innovation releases and long-term support releases. If you look at 21C, it's an innovation release. It's a offering to you of the new features we are planning to have long-term support for in later releases. It's a whole bunch of new features, but it is there for what we call innovation. Therefore, if you choose to upgrade to 21C, very soon you'll be upgrading to 23 as well. If you're a company that likes to upgrade frequently, 21C is great for you. But if you're like perhaps the majority of people and you think, I don't like upgrading, they're expensive, they take budget, they take time, they take testing, then you want to always be sticking on the long-term support releases, which means you want to be on 19C and you would stay there as long as possible. And then when the next long-term support release comes out, which will be 23C, you would move to that. So for the vast majority of us, we would never be using 21C in our production environments, not because of 21C, simply because we want to be taking advantage of those long-term support releases to minimize the amount of times we have to upgrade. In particular, you can do a direct upgrade from any of the I used to say supported releases, but even 11.2 is no longer supported. But any release you're probably running at the moment can do a direct upgrade to 19C, and that's probably where you want to stay. Another reason is that's why not all platforms have 21C, because it is all about innovation. It's not about running a lot of production systems on here. It is production ready, but we don't want to be running production systems unless you're one of those customers that is happy to regularly upgrade. So be aware of that. 21C is out there, but most of you will be running 19C and then jumping to 23C afterwards. Now let me talk about why you must use 21C. Let me give you an example. This is probably the most simple example. The first thing that happens when everyone I've met so far has installed 21C, they jump onto asktom.oracle.com, or they send me a direct message, or they jump onto Stack Overflow, etc. And they say, look, I've installed 21C. I've gone to Oracle Home Network Admin like we always do. I've set up a TNS names. I'm trying to connect to the database, and I get an error. And all of a sudden they're going, 21C is broken. It's not going to work. There's something wrong. What have I done wrong? There's nothing wrong with 21C. In 21C, and you can go to this link. This is a link to the documentation. The last few letters there, ROOH, hopefully are a clue. That stands for Read Only Oracle Home. That's actually not a 21C feature. It's an 18C feature. But in 21C, it becomes the default. And you see, it's the same thing. 21CXC, everyone's on Stack Overflow saying, I can't, I couldn't connect to the database. The TNS names files in 21C are stored elsewhere. It's not a 21C feature, it's an 18C feature, but we default to the read-only Oracle Home in 21C. This is why you should use it. Let me give you a second example. If you're used to, for example, using case-insensitive passwords in the Aura password file, you can still run that. That's no problems. You can type in my secret password for 21C, but when you try connect, notice the case is different. You'll get invalid username or password. So there are a lot of subtle things that change with every new release of the database. When 11 went to 12, 12 to 19, 19 to 21, etc. Lots of little things change to make the product either more secure, more robust, more efficient, etc. Read only Oracle Homes, case-insensitive passwords, etc. So even if you never plan to use 21C in production, you're going to go 19C to 23C. These are the reasons why you should be installing 21C in your sandbox environments, your play environments, your development environments, etc., to make sure that you're familiar with how it works. Because otherwise what happens is when 23C comes along, and that's the next long-term support release, and you're thinking, yep, I'm going to upgrade to it, you'll encounter all these little idiosyncrasies when you're trying to do the upgrade or when you're under more time constraints. So don't use 21C for production unless you're a regular upgrader. But make sure as a DBA or a developer, make sure you download it, download 21CXE, install it, start to learn the features in 21C. And we're going to talk about all these features today, such that when you go to 23C, it's not a surprise. This is one of the reasons I tell people if they're going from 11 to 12 to 19, they should move to a pluggable database as soon as possible. Because that means when they finally do it in production, it's not like pluggable database is this brand new thing they've never seen. There's not much difference between unplugged, non-container databases and container databases, but there's lots of little subtle differences like these things we see here. The sooner you start picking up those things, the more skilled you are and the more ready you are for 23C when it comes along. So the best way to learn 21C, real easy. Download Express Edition, it's free, unlimited use, plenty of goodies. All the features are in there pretty much, and you can start playing with it right now, right today. So for the rest of this session, what have I got the rest? I've got about 37 minutes. I'm going to do what we call a degustation or a sampler. Like when you go to a restaurant and they give you lots of little samples of lots of things, that's what the rest of this session is. We're not going to deep dive into every single feature or a lot of features. We're going to touch on them such that hopefully it'll inspire you to go off, download 21C Express Edition and play with each of these features to become more comfortable with them. Then if you choose to use 21C in production, you'll be fine. If you choose to wait for 23C, you'll still be fine because you've now understood some of the features that are coming. Now, believe it or not, we've got 21 features to cover. I don't think we'll get there, but you can see there's a lot of slides. We're going to go number 1, number 2, all the way up to number 21 if we can. I don't think it's possible, but I have 21 features in there that we could potentially cover if we have enough time. So let's get straight into it. As I said, if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat line. I'll look over this way from time to time and we'll see how we go. Let me close off that, keep the chat line open. There we go. Probably the most exciting feature, the thing that everyone spoke about when 21C first came out was, of course, blockchain, because everyone talks about Bitcoin and Dogecoin and Ethereum and, it's cryptocurrencies, all the exciting stuff. It all runs on a blockchain, so it's blockchain, blockchain, blockchain. Everyone's excited about blockchain. I don't want to talk about blockchain because for the vast majority of people, a blockchain perhaps is not appropriate. However, I'd like to talk about something that perhaps is related to blockchain that perhaps almost every single person can use when they move to 21 or 23C. Perhaps one of the things that often is a sticking point for many organizations is no matter how stringent their security rules are, the DBA or admin always can update the data. We might have security controls for all the regular users, but the DBA always has that power to go in and do whatever they want. Now, in the past, Oracle has had solutions to even control the DBA's ability to update data. We have a product called Database Vault. Now, Database Vault's an awesome product, but it's massive. Like, it is a complete security infrastructure for the administration of all your data in auditing, capture, logging, etc. It's a massive solution and perhaps overkill if you just want to be able to stop the DBAs from modifying the data. If that's an issue for you, I think you have perhaps a process issue as well, because ultimately you should be able to trust your DBAs. But if you don't, then Database Vault was a huge solution to what seems a fairly small problem. In 21C, we have a table that's related to a blockchain table called an immutable table. And it's just a very simple, you create a mutable table. I'm calling it no messing around with my table. And really there's just a normal table, except you have some additional clauses. I'm not allowed to drop it until it's been, for example, 1 day of not being accessed. I'm not allowed to delete the data until perhaps 16 days after insert, and you can nominate these figures. However, once you've created an immutable table, as the name suggests, you can't modify the data. If there's some data in it, that's no fun. If I try to update the data, I'm simply not allowed to. The only operation you can do on an immutable table is insert. There's no delete, there's no truncate, there's no update. All you can ever do is add new rows. That's the only thing you can do. So be aware of what you're getting yourself in for here, right? There is no way around this. In fact, for example, I've tried to update here. Who am I connected as here? Even connected as sys, you cannot do anything to that table. If I flick back to the syntax, I can't even drop it until a day of its idle, even if I'm sys. If I really wanted to drop this table, and the expiry date hasn't been reached yet, the only way to do it is to drop the entire pluggable database. So be aware of what you're getting into, but if you want to have that ability to guarantee that the data in there has only been inserted, has never been changed, immutable tables might be for you. Number 2, we got some new plan tools for those people that like doing performance tuning. Often when we're looking at the performance differences between, we're looking at a particular SQL and we want to see what 2 plans differences are, it's generally we'd had to use a tool, something like Toad or SQL Developer or some graphical tool to try and compare the tools. Here's the same SQL statement, select star from scott.emp, one's a full table scan, one's an index. I can do 2 explain plans. Now I've got this new facility called dbmsexplan.compareExplain. I type in the 2 statement IDs and I get this lovely report as a TLOB, which shows me the differences between the plans. There's compare explain, there's compare cursor. I can just pick 2 cursors in the shared pool. So now it's much easier to simply grab 2 plans for the same SQL and just show me how they are different. Number 3, you get an idea that we're trying to get through as many features as we can here. SQL set extensions. As we know, SQL is a set-based language. Our aim is always to do operations in sets. And if I create a couple of tables here, I've got a table called employee, which is the entire scott.emp table, and all the employees just for department 10. So these tables have the same structure, but one has more rows than the other. We've always been able to do this, select star from emp minus select star from department 10, and it's all the rows which are 20 and 30, etc. However, the columns that are sitting there, like the select star, it's all these columns define the amount of distinctness in terms of the results. So it doesn't look like it here, but we've actually sorted these results and removed the duplicates. For example, if I just do select department number from M minus department number from department 10, I don't get 10 rows anymore. I just get 2 rows. I'm only getting the distinct results. Because I did select star, I got all the rows because we have the primary key included. But if I'm just selecting a particular column, I only get the distinct differences. I don't get 10 rows, I get just the 2. In 21C, we now have the except keyword, which is pretty much the same as minus, but except is the ANSI standard, and except also is similar to union. I can do except all. So just like union and union all, union does a distinct, union all includes all the duplicates. I have except and except all in 21C, such that I can also include all the rows if I need to. Another nice facility coming in is the checksum function. What checksum does is it's an aggregation function like min, max, average, etc. And what it does is, depending on your grouping, in this case I'm grouping by department number, I will do a checksum for all of the employee names for each group. So the checksum for all the employee names for department 20 was this, etc. This could be quite useful if you're looking to see if rows have changed when you're doing things like updates, etc. You can take a checksum as you query, and then when you go to update the rows, you can do a checksum again to see if the data has changed by someone else. It's a way of doing optimistic locking. You can have as many checksums as you want. The only thing I think is missing is you can't do checksum of star. You can't simply consolidate all the columns together and do a checksum of all the columns. That would be nice for the optimistic locking scenario. However, what you could do, for example, is amalgamate all the columns you want to using, say, JSON. So now I have a department number and a single value by aggregation for each of those rows, and then I could do a checksum of that. So there are opportunities there to do checksum on aggregations or multiple columns. You just have to do a bit of playing around with JSON or something like that similar to bring all those columns together. But checksum could be useful for optimistic locking. Number 4, let's talk about what I call the going to lunch syndrome. Back in the client server days, this used to be a nightmare where someone would commence a transaction in, say, Oracle Forms, and then they'd simply walk off to lunch and leave a row locked, and there they'd bring your whole application down because no one could get access to that row. We don't have this going to lunch problem anymore because we generally don't use client server applications. We use multiple tier applications and web servers. However, we still have the issue, not necessarily when a person goes to lunch, but when an application server thread goes to lunch. And what do we mean by that? Is when an application server connection crashes and it leaves locks on the database. The problem there is we normally have to wait for some sort of application timeout for that session to be regained back from the database, and therefore its locks released. It's one of those things where often a DBA has to go in and kill off all the sessions in the connection pool because it's causing problems. In 21C, and I think several of these features have now been backported to 19C as well, you can now say, if someone is idle, but they are a blocker, they're stopping someone else from getting a lock, you can actually set a maximum amount of time they're allowed to do that before they get their session killed. The only sad thing is the granularity, that number 1 there is in minutes. I'd like to have, say, 30 seconds or 20 seconds, but it's actually in minutes, so 1 minute is as low as you can go. To give you an example, I launch a session, I do delete from T, and I just leave that session. I just walk away from my desk. Someone else comes along and tries to lock that row, and of course they get stuck. They're waiting on this session here for the lock to be released, which will never be released because I've simply walked away from that session. This person waits and waits and waits and waits, and eventually, in fact, in this case, it was after 47 seconds, they actually got access to the session. It said, yep, you managed to update the row. The original session, it got killed off. So that's an example of the max idle blocker parameter. What will happen is if you're idle, but you're blocking people, you can now be killed such that you free up those resources for other people to get access to them. Number 5, gradual password rollover. And I'll start with a nice simple demo. That's implemented by the usual thing we call profiles. There's this new thing called password rollover time. The number 4 means for up to 4 days, I can use an old or a new password. So if I create this user called demo, his password is my current password, and I've assigned him to the profile called Let's Be Gentle. He's going to get 4 days of rollover time. Then obviously I can connect with my current password. That's the current password. If I alter that user and give them a new password, maybe the auditor came in and say that password has to be longer or changed, etc. I got my new password, which is pesky auditor's new password. Because I have a rollover time of 4 days, I can connect as the new password, that's no problems, but I can also connect as the old password. And I'll be able to do that for up to 4 days. So I'm giving sort of a grace period as to how I can use both passwords, the old and the new. The nice thing is, if you're using unified auditing, you'll be able to tell when people are using the old or the new password. If you look in the audit trail, it'll have login info verifier 12C new, which means they use their new password, or verifier 12C old, which means they use their old password. Similarly, if someone is actually connected to the database, if someone is defined to the database, you can actually see when they've entered that rollover period. So they use a demo here, they are open, but they are also in a rollover period. So they've picked up a new password and they're allowed to use their old password. So it's very easy to see the current status of a user as well. A lot of people, when they saw this feature, went, oh, who cares? Like, is it that much of a big deal to simply contact a user and say, hey, we've changed your password, or you have to change your password. This is it. Most of us, when we log into email, don't use our old password. When the password expires, you use a new one. That's the end of the discussion. The reason is not necessarily for users. We can be nasty to them. The reason is more for applications. One of the most common security holes that we see in applications is we give our particular schemas, those sessions that actually connect to the database on behalf of an application, we give them a password and we never change them because, hopefully not, but it's either in a configuration file somewhere or stored in a wallet. But effectively, we've assigned a password, we stick it somewhere, and we don't have to bother changing again, so we leave it forever. The reason we do that is because if my password was in a wallet and I want to change that password, then straight away after I change the password, all my connections immediately break because I haven't rolled that wallet change out to all the application servers. It's almost impossible to do all at the same time. It becomes a maintenance problem when I'm trying to change the password for a whole stack of systems and those wallets are stored in various places. By having a rollover password, it solves this problem. I can change the password, set a rollover period, and that gives me a few days to go visit each of these application servers, update the wallets, etc., to pick up the new passwords. I never have to take a system down now just because I want to change a password that has in the past never been changed. So this will keep your auditors happy. Number 6, a safer version of data pump. Now, what do I mean by safer version of data pump? Let me give you an example. I'm doing a data pump here of the Scott schema. I've logged on as my administrative user. I'm dumping out a dump file called stop, and I'm simping out the Scott schema. That will create a dump file. But a dump file really is just a proprietary data format. And if you look inside it, we can see it literally is just effectively, you can see the text in there. It's cryptic, but it's kind of, so I'm going in there, I'm using a hex editor just to actually edit some of that information, right? We can do that. As long as I can see the dump file, I could actually go in there and manipulate the contents. If I then import that data file, data pump doesn't complain. It says, yeah, that's fine. And at the end of the exercise, guess what? I've managed to corrupt my database. Well, not corrupt it. I've hacked my database. I've managed to put myself in here as a salesman simply because I had access to the data pump data file. By default, as long as you edit the file in a structure that data pump still thinks it's a genuine data pump file, you can corrupt all the data you want. Obviously, this is a security hole. So in 21C, you can now incorporate a checksum into the data pump file. You simply do checksum equals yes. At the end of the data pump, we actually calculate a checksum on the file and store that in the data pump file as well. When you come to import that file, you add verify checksum equals yes, and if someone has manipulated the data so it no longer matches the checksum, you'll get a file checksum error and you can no longer import it. Now, I want to stress, you have to actually add this parameter if you want to do the check. The reason we made it optional is you might do a verify like this and say, yep, the data is obviously been modified or corrupted, but you might still want to import it. You might go to a different database, a standalone database, and import it there so you can see what has happened. So we give you that option, but be aware that just when you add a checksum on the data pump export, doesn't mean we'll automatically check that on the import. You have to nominate that you want to verify it, and then if it is verified, then it'll continue on. If it fails here, you have the choice then of not verifying it and loading it somewhere else so you can go check the data. Number 7, DataGuard. I love DataGuard, and I'll take a moment here to say that I think every single production database, did I actually put this? No. I think every single production database you have should have a DataGuard clone. Now, people say, oh, that's too expensive, I have to pay license, etc. I dispute that. And the reason I say it is almost every place I've ever known has a minimum of 2 databases. They have one production database and one non-production database. Most of us have many more Oracle databases, but the vast majority, as everyone always has at least 2. One for production and one for everything else. So that's 2 machines you already have licensed. So why wouldn't you take your production node and put DataGuard on the non-production node and copy production to that? The resource cost in terms of CPU of moving archive logs is so small. It's incredibly efficient. It really just becomes a disk space cost, and disks are incredibly cheap. You could put the worst, slowest, crappiest disks on there and have a DataGuard copy on there. It costs you nothing in terms of licensing because those nodes are already licensed because you've got more than one database server. And the benefits of having a copy of production are huge. You can test out application deployments because you've got this thing called snapshot standby. You can break the link with production, do whatever you want to it, and reinstate the link. Snapshot standby is super cool. So I can test application deployments. I could gather my stats off that node instead of the production one. I could do backups off that node. I could do security patching testing. I could do destruction testing. I could do all sorts of things on that copy, safely knowing I'm not damaging production in any simple way. The benefits of having a DataGuard copy of your database are so much more than disaster recovery. Hopefully that convinces you that having DataGuard is super cool. But one of the only problems with DataGuard is, well, when you go to the documentation to set up your DataGuard node, well, you go to chapter 3, creating a physical standby, and you start reading the instructions, and there's a lot to do before you got one to do. It's a lengthy, complicated process. You don't want to make any mistakes because you wouldn't want to, for example, do something wrong to your production database. It takes a lot of work. In 21C, we have the easiest DataGuard ever. Literally, you go into your DataGuard broker and say, prepare the database for DataGuard. It's almost that easy. There's a couple of parameters you add. And I should note there's a couple of documentation issues. So let me walk through this, because if you try this yourself, you're going to get perhaps a little bit annoyed. But let me walk through how to fix it. This is the example you'll see in the documentation. It says this is how easy it is to get a DataGuard node ready. And it looks really easy because it's just a one-line command. I just prepare the database to DataGuard, pick the new name for your standby, nominate some parameters, your recovery file destination, and the broker config files, and you'll get an error. That's literally a cut and paste from the documentation, and you get an error. Unfortunately, it's not DG broker config file, it's broker config file. So you change that in there, and you get an error anyway. It turns out it's not broker config file. There's a underscore after the file before the 1 and the 2. But once you've done that, and we'll get the documentation fixed, but just so you know, if you go and try this, don't get frustrated. Once you've done that, literally, the job is done. It goes and basically creates the initialization parameters, gets the database up, does all these bits and pieces, gets everything ready, chugs away, does an RMAN duplicate, gets it all sorted out, gets the log archive destinations done, archive logging done, and at the end of it, we're done. Literally a one-line command over a few lines, and the whole thing is done. No more reading hundreds of pages of documentation. So it's no more excuses. It's super easy now to have a DataGuard database running on your system. And as I said, if you've got more than one server, you can pretty much do it for free. Number 8, JSON, which obviously is the future, just got a whole lot easier in 21C. For a long time, it was XML. Now JSON's the cool kid on the block. Therefore, we have to invent some new architectures to handle that. There's plenty of good JSON stuff already in 12C and 19C. In 21C, we're just taking it to the next level. For example, now we have a dedicated JSON data type. In 19 and 12, you could do a clob or a varchar2, and you could add a check constraint saying check is JSON. But now in 21C, we have a dedicated JSON data type, which will store the data in the most efficient binary format we can out on the data files. Now you can just simply put in some JSON in as a varchar too, and it works just fine. So it becomes much more easy now just to insert information into a table, even though it's being stored in a specialized proprietary format. If you describe it, don't panic. If you're on SQL plus 19 or below, you'll get this JSON is undefined because we don't know what that data type is in SQL plus 19 and below. But if you're on, at least you're on a more recent version, you'll see that it says, yep, it can tell you what the data type is JSON. But then all the normal functions apply. You can do JSON value and extract from the root the address.city and you get Perth. You can do the normal dot notation as well. Plus we have some extensions to the data types that come out. You can also print it out in a nice pretty format as well. So even though it's stored in a proprietary binary format, you can actually get it in a nice output as per normal. So all that stuff is pretty much the same as 19 and 12. But then we have extensions both in the PL SQL and the DML space. So now I can take JSON as a parameter. And so I can, for example, say with the PL SQL object types, I can say that I can take this customer JSON and convert it to a PL SQL object type just with a straight assignment statement. And I can do all the normal cool things with PL SQL JSON operatives. So does it have a status node? If it does, add, basically this. If it doesn't have a status node, then add silver. And I now get the output of this function starts having new information in there. I can also do direct DML straight into a JSON fragment now from the database. So I can update my customers table. So it used to have, I think, where's my first one? There we go. It used to have just Connor and my address. I can update that now. I can say, do a transformation, add set last updated equals this timestamp, set address.zip equals 6001, my name equals Connor because I spelled it wrong before. I'm going to rename a node. So the name not name becomes first name. I'll append. So I can actually dive in there and modify my JSON structure just with simple commands and simple DML. So now I added a zip code. I changed name to first name. I added a JSON array of friends. Once again, I can now dive into the JSON structure with simple DML and modify it. So lots of cool stuff there. Similarly, I can now create indexes on my JSON structure, even if it's not just simple values. If I've got a row in here called customers, the first name is Nigel, and Nigel has 2 addresses. I can now create an index on for example, the zip code. Normally that would not be allowed because this one row produces multiple values. How would we normally index that? But we have this thing in 21C called a multi-value index, which will actually let me have an index on a JSON structure, which actually has multiple values for a single element. So in this case, the zip code appears twice, but I'll be able to do a multi-value index range scan. So I can now do the JSON exist queries that you've done before, looking for a zip code of 1, 2, 3, 4, and it doesn't have to scan the whole table. I don't have to create an entire text index as well. I can use this multi-value index to actually find this particular zip code. Number 9. How am I going for time? We're not doing too badly. We have a thing now called the attention log. If you go into where the alert log is stored and do your ADR diagnostic destination location, you used to always see only one file that started with the letter A. That was the alert log. But now we have this thing called the attention log. And this reflects that the alert log has sort of changed over the years. When I first started working with Oracle back in sort of Oracle 6, the alert log was pretty much that. Only when things go wrong, like your database starts, stops, or you're in Oracle 600, would something be in there. Now you go look at the alert log. It's huge. There's a lot of information in there. You can see this one's already 300 kilobytes on a freshly created database. So we invented this thing called an attention log because if your alert log looks like this, with all this diagnostic information, which is very useful when it comes to troubleshooting, looking at that, how you decide if you need to page someone out, it's much harder than it used to be. It used to be, there's an Oracle 600 in there, we should page someone, there's something gone wrong. I say page someone, we should call someone. We don't use pages anymore, do we? We would send them a mobile phone. But it's very hard with all that detail in the alert log to decide, do I need to call someone out? Is something actually happening? So the attention log is a way of adding some structure. So rather than having all the information, it's a condensed form and it's got structure as well, which makes it easy to parse for various tools. So every row in there is a JSON fragment and they're tagged in a certain kind of way. We have notification, urgency, info, etc. For example, start in the database is just information. It's probably you wouldn't have to probably call someone. Heavy swapping has an urgency of soon. We probably need to get someone involved here because something's going wrong on our system. With those tags, we have categories for them. So for every single row, they'll have a type, which are they error, a warning, or a notification. We'll have an urgency, immediate, soon, deferrable, or information. Immediate means your database has perhaps crashed. You have scope, which is nice. It'll tell you what's the impact of what's going on. If a session has crashed, it's probably just at session level. A process could be a slightly higher level, but maybe you've lost an entire pluggable instance, etc. So we're giving a scope. What is the scale of the problem that's going on here? And the nice thing is it'll give you a target. This helps with tools, for example, if they need to parse it. It says, who should I contact? If it's, for example, a locking problem, maybe the application developer. If we have a bad password, maybe a security administration, etc., data up storage, etc. So the attention log now is trying to categorize that data to give you the best path and the best path forward to make a decision as to what to do. Number 10, in-memory licensing. I love the in-memory feature because every time I've done a demo for customers, it blows their mind in terms of how incredibly powerful it is. The only thing holding back in-memory is this. It's expensive. And I've never met a customer that has gone, I don't like the in-memory feature. Every customer I've ever met says, I love the in-memory feature, but I can't afford the license. To help you with that, we now have an in-memory feature that everybody gets. And I should note, if you're on 19C, you get this in 19C as well. So you should take advantage of it. We now have this thing called the base level of in-memory, which lets you have up to 16 gigs, I think. Yes, 16 gigs of in-memory for free on each instance of your database. Now, you might be thinking these days of giant servers that 16 gigabytes isn't much, but let me give you a simple example here. I'm going to create a table called customer products, which has 1,200 products in there. Customer customers, which has 10,000 customers. So I've got 10,000 customers in my application. They can buy up to any from one of 1,200 products. And let me create some fake customer sales. I'm putting in 250 million customer sales here. And I'm adding some various text here to make these rows reasonably sized. At the end of that entire exercise, I've got 12 or 13 gigabytes of customer data. So even a table with 250 million rows is less than 16 gigabytes of in-memory. And don't forget, in-memory actually compresses the data. So I could run a query, a typical kind of analytics query on this customer data, customer sales, customer products, etc. It took 1:15 on this machine here. I put those three tables into in-memory, wait for it to be populated. Now it runs in 2 seconds, not 75 seconds. These are the kind of demos that blow people away. And I didn't even go anywhere near 16 gigabytes of in-memory here. So what you can do is you can literally, for example, if you've got partition tables, put your most recent partitions into in-memory. Even if you've only got 16 gigs, you'll be amazed at the dramatic performance improvements you'll be able to get, and you won't have spent a single dollar on an in-memory license. And what you'll find is people say, why'd you do this? What we find is people are so amazed at the benefits they get, even with 16 gigs of in-memory, then it becomes much easier to justify the full in-memory license because you find so many more opportunities to absolutely transform your query performance. Number 11, Analytic SQL came in way back in 8.2. They're super cool, they're super powerful, but you've got to type a lot of stuff. So for example, if I'm, for example, doing a window function where I'm getting the maximum salary for basically for each department number, then if I want to do the max, the min, the average, etc., it's a very common kind of scenario that we use the same analytic clause for multiple columns, because generally it doesn't make a lot of sense to mix and match these. People tend to look at data aggregated at a common level. So in this case, I'm getting a list of each employee, each department number, and then for across each individual department, I want the max, min, average sal, the max, min, commission, the max, min, etc., etc. They all have this common expression that I have to cut paste all the way down. The risk here is if I ever need to change that, I might mess one of them up. In 21C, we can now define what we call a window. I can say I have a window called W department, which is partition by department number. And so now I simply do over this defined window, and that will simply map this into the entire window definition. And the nice thing is it's effectively like a template that you can expand on. So for example, I could also say, I want to use in this particular column, I want to use partition by, let me try that again. I want to use partition by department number, which is window department. But for this particular column, I also want to add order by salary. So I can make an amendment or an addenda to the window function definition as well. This particular column might be, I want to order by sale and add a windowing clause as well. So it's not just it has to be hard coded, it becomes a template that you can extend for those special cases. But it just makes it nice, a nice, concise, more robust form of the window definition. You also get more cool analytics in 21C. Let's look at some data here from the employee table, and I'm looking at everyone's salary compared to the average salary. So the average salary is somewhere around about, I can't remember, 3,000. So we've got a lot of people here who are under the average salary and just a few people who are over the average salary, except for this person here who's the president. They get a whole lot of information. But the vast majority of people are under the salary. Is there some functions that can actually show me this information? And there's a function called the skew function. So I can do the skewness pop function, and it gives me the result of 1. Now, what does 1 mean? We can draw some graphs. If the data is evenly distributed across both sides of the average, you'll get a skew of 0. So if the data is evenly spread across the average, you get a skew of 0. If it's mainly underneath the average, like our data we just saw, you get a skew greater than 0. The higher the skew number, the further it is away from the average, underneath the average. If the skew is less than 0, the data is biased above the average. So we have this new skewness population function in 21C for looking at data around the average. 541. Can we squeeze one more in? I don't think so. I think that's
sorry, Connor. I'm Mario. Just let you know that we are near to close the session. We have still 5 minutes, so we can give people to do some question if they need it. So just to let you know, but please go on.
You will have noticed that I've simply moved to the wrap-up slide.
Okay.
Let's wrap it up. We got 11 of our 21 features covered. And you might be thinking, well, is it worth going to 21C? Because if there's only 21 major new features, well, I didn't even cover the ones I didn't put in the slides. There's a whole heap of new features: JDBC virtual threads, zero downtime time zone upgrades, rolling over JVM upgrades, immediate unified auditing, mandatory profiles. It goes on and on and on and on. 21C has an enormous amount of features over and above 19C. Thankfully, because 19C is the long-term support release, a lot of these features are being backported into 19C, into the various RUs, such that you get access to them early and you don't have to jump to an innovation release. But as I said at the start, I thoroughly encourage you, you should get 21C installed and start playing with these new features, seeing how it works, seeing how it's different to 19C, because that will prepare you for the next long-term support release, which is 23C. Having done that in your non-production environments, you probably don't want to use 21C in your production environments because of the long-term support implications. So you have that choice. If you're happy to upgrade, go with 21C. If you're looking for long-term support releases, stay with 19C, use 21C in development, and then move to 23C, and you'll be well equipped to use it and take advantage of all the cool features in 23C, which will be a long-term support release. Thank you very much. It's 5:43 my time. So someone said, will I share the PowerPoint? Yes, the PowerPoint will be distributed to the IT OUG, or I'll host it somewhere, but certainly you'll be able to get all the slides. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time. yeah, feel free to ask any questions now. I'll stay around just for a few minutes. Obviously, Martin's got to get ready and I don't want to impinge into his time. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now. But otherwise, I'll be hanging around on Twitter. Feel free just to ping me on Twitter and you can ask me questions there at any time. Doesn't have to be right now or even today. Anytime you want, reach out to me with questions about 21C and I'll be on Twitter. So thank you very much for your time and I'll hand back to our organizers.